The shoelaces were tied, and the front door clicked shut as Sarah Hamilton stepped out for her evening jog on October 19th, 1999. It was a routine she rarely broke. The 26-year-old kindergarten teacher followed the same path through the quiet roads of Millbrook Township, her footsteps fading as the sky dimmed. She carried no phone, only a small watch strapped to her wrist. Her route took her past the old grain silo, along Copper Creek Road, and across the narrow bridge that bent slightly over the water. Locals knew the path well. It was considered safe. That night, it was not. Sarah passed a neighbor walking his dog at approximately 6:45 p.m. He would later recall her friendly wave and steady pace. After that, no one saw her alive again. The jog that should have lasted 30 minutes stretched into hours with no return. Inside her small house, the lights were left on. A cup of coffee sat cooling on the counter, still half full. Her running shoes were gone, but her work bag leaned against the chair where she had placed it after school. Nothing suggested she had planned to be away for long. By 9 p.m., her mother, Margaret Hamilton, began to worry. Sarah was never careless about time. Margaret phoned her daughter's landline, then drove past a jogging route herself, headlights scanning the dark edges of the road. There was no trace of Sarah, only the sound of crickets and the quiet rush of the creek. At midnight, a missing person report was filed. Officers from the Millbrook Township Sheriff's Department responded quickly. They retraced the route with flashlights, calling her name into night air. Volunteers joined in, their voices carrying through the fields. Nothing answered back. The search stretched into early morning. Damp air settled over the bridge, and dew clung to the grass. It was near sunrise when one officer spotted what he first thought was a pile of discarded clothing near Copper Creek Bridge. As the beam of his flashlight cut across the embankment, the shape became unmistakable. Sarah Hamilton's body lay at the base of the bridge, partially hidden in the tall weeds. Her running clothes were torn, and there were clear signs of a struggle. The jog had ended violently, only a few miles from her home. The bridge was sealed off as a crime scene. Yellow tape went up, officers marked evidence, and photographs captured every angle. Tire tracks, footprints, and broken branches suggested a sudden attack. A single earring lay in the dirt nearby, glinting under the harsh light. Word spread quickly through the township. By the time the sun rose, a crowd of neighbors stood silently at the roadblock, staring at the flashing lights in disbelief. Sarah Hamilton, the young teacher who was loved by so many, had been taken in the middle of her ordinary evening run. Investigators began gathering evidence, but answers were scarce. The only certainty was chilling. Someone had crossed her path that night, and that encounter ended in murder. The silence that followed would soon turn into a mystery that lasted decades. Sarah Hamilton was 26 years old when her life ended. She was known in Millbrook Township as a young kindergarten teacher whose classroom was filled with drawings, small books, and the sound of children learning their first words. Parents trusted her, and students adored her. She had chosen teaching not for recognition, but because she believed early education shaped lives. Her days began early. She prepared lessons, decorated the classroom with bright colors, and kept a patient smile for every child who struggled. Colleagues describe her as quiet but dependable, someone who never missed a day of work and often stayed late to prepare the next morning's activities. Outside school, Sarah lived a simple, disciplined life. She rented a modest home only a few miles from the elementary building. Evenings were reserved for exercise, reading, and calls to her mother, Margaret Hamilton. The bond between them was strong. Margaret was not just a parent, but also Sarah's closest confidant. They spoke almost daily, sharing small details of their routines. Sarah valued health and balance. She rarely missed her evening jog, choosing familiar routes through the township roads. Neighbors were used to seeing her run past at the same time, her steady pace and bright athletic clothes marking the routine. It was a part of her life that gave structure and calm. She had no criminal history, no secret troubles, and no complicated disputes. Friends describe her as steady and kind, a person who avoided conflict and focused on her work. Her ambitions were modest. She hoped to save enough money to buy a home in the community and continue teaching for years to come. On October 19, 1999, Sarah was living a life that seemed safe and predictable. Her mother believed she would one day marry, raise a family, and stay close to Millbrook Township. Everything about her future suggested stability and promise. That promise was stolen in a single night. The teacher who dedicated her days to children, who maintained discipline and care in every part of her life, never returned from her evening run. Her background offered no reason for violence, no clue that danger would cross her path. The tragedy was not only in how Sarah died, but in how much she had yet to live. The first officer to spot her body stopped at the edge of Copper Creek Bridge just after sunrise. What looked like discarded clothing in the brush revealed itself under the beam of a flashlight. Within moments, the grim reality set in. The missing teacher had been found. Sarah Hamilton's body lay on her side at the base of the embankment. Her running clothes were torn, her shoes muddied. Scratches covered her arms, and her hair was tangled with leaves and dirt. The scene made clear that she had fought, but she had not escaped. Officers marked off the bridge and surrounding fields with yellow tape. The area was treated as a crime scene, every inch examined for signs of what happened. Detectives crouched near Sarah's body, noting the position of her limbs and the disturbed soil around her. It suggested she had been dragged from the road toward the creek. A single earring glinted near her body, separated from the other. Her watch, cracked at the face, displayed a frozen time, 6:58 p.m. The detail would later become a haunting marker of her final moments. Evidence technicians began their careful work. They photographed the scene from multiple angles, collected soil samples, and secured pieces of torn fabric. Nearby branches bore fresh breaks, as though someone had forced their way through. Tire impressions in the dirt were preserved with plaster molds, though their patterns were too common to immediately identify a vehicle. Sarah's running path had been chosen for its safety, but the details revealed vulnerability. The narrow road offered little visibility, and the bridge provided a point where a sudden attack could occur unseen. It appeared that Sarah had been approached quickly, overpowered, and forced off the roadside. Detectives noted bruising and marks consistent with restraint. Early indicators pointed to an assault, but the specifics would rely on autopsy results. Forensic investigators gathered biological samples from beneath her fingernails, hoping they might hold traces of her attacker. As word spread, the bridge became a silent gathering point. Neighbors stood at a distance behind the tape, shocked to see the young woman whose life had been so familiar now lying at the center of a criminal investigation. The quiet township was not prepared for a scene like this. By mid-morning, Sarah's body was transported to the county medical examiner's office. The preliminary findings confirmed violent assault and strangulation as the cause of death. The timeline placed her murder within an hour of her last sighting on the jogging path. Despite the careful evidence collection, detectives faced an immediate challenge. The physical traces were limited, and the technology of 1999 offered few tools for precise DNA identification. Samples were preserved, but analysis would not produce the answers investigators hoped for. The discovery at Copper Creek Bridge gave the case urgency and direction, but also raised a troubling question. If evidence could not directly identify the killer, then how could investigators find the person who had crossed Sarah's path that night? The first steps of the investigation had begun, but the path forward already showed signs of uncertainty. Detectives began their work immediately after Sarah Hamilton's body was found near Copper Creek Bridge. The first priority was to reconstruct her final hours and determine who might have crossed her path that evening. Officers moved door to door, speaking with anyone who lived along the jogging route. A neighbor recalled seeing Sarah pass shortly before 7 p.m. Another remembered hearing the sound of quick footsteps near the bridge, but dismissed it at the time. A third claimed to have noticed a dark vehicle parked on the shoulder, though he could not provide a plate number. Each fragment added to the timeline, but none gave investigators a clear suspect. At the elementary school, colleagues and parents were interviewed. They described Sarah as dedicated and routine-oriented, someone unlikely to place herself in dangerous situations. Detectives asked about disputes, personal relationships, or anyone who might have held a grudge. Nothing pointed toward an immediate threat. Attention turned to men within the community. Some were neighbors who occasionally saw Sarah jogging. Others were acquaintances who knew her only in passing. The possibility of a stranger attack was considered, but investigators first focused on individuals closer to her daily life. One name surfaced quickly: Tommy Rodriguez. He was 28 years old, lived only a mile from Sarah, and had once attended school events where his younger cousin had been in Sarah's class. Detectives learned that Tommy often walked near Copper Creek Road during evenings. On the night of October 19th, he claimed to have been at home, though no one could confirm his alibi with certainty. His behavior during questioning drew attention. He appeared nervous, offered inconsistent times, and avoided eye contact when asked about Sarah. Rumors spread quickly in the small township, and soon residents whispered that Tommy had something to do with the crime. Investigators collected a DNA sample from him, along with fingerprints and fibers from his clothing. They compared these against the evidence retrieved from Sarah's body and the crime scene. The results came back with no match. Despite suspicion, there was no physical proof linking him to the murder. Detectives expanded their focus. They examined a list of registered sex offenders in nearby counties, questioned drifters who passed through town, and reviewed calls made to the sheriff's office about suspicious vehicles in the area. One report mentioned a man loitering near the creek weeks earlier, but the description was too vague to pursue. The case grew heavier with speculation. Community members debated openly about who could have been responsible. Some pointed at strangers. Others insisted it had to be someone local. Fear spread through households. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk home from school alone. Evening routines changed. Investigators gathered every possible lead. They re-examined the broken branches, the tire tracks, and the scattered items at the bridge. Yet each piece of evidence failed to deliver a solid direction. The technology of 1999 limited what could be extracted from the biological material. DNA was collected, but the process was slow, expensive, and often inconclusive without a direct match in the database. Meanwhile, Sarah's mother, Margaret, attended every public briefing. She listened as detectives explained progress, though she understood that progress was fragile. Behind the firm words and reassurances, investigators had no suspect they could charge. Weeks passed. The focus on Tommy Rodriguez faded when results continued to exclude him. The rumors that had surrounded his name did not vanish, but legally, there was nothing to hold him for. Other suspects came and went in the same fashion. Each seemed promising at first, then collapsed under scrutiny. By late winter, the investigation slowed. Detectives had reconstructed Sarah's last known movements as carefully as possible. They knew she had left for her jog, passed familiar points on her route, and been attacked near Copper Creek Bridge. They knew she had fought back. They knew she had died within minutes. But what they did not know was who had ended her life. News of Sarah Hamilton's murder spread quickly through Millbrook Township. The discovery at Copper Creek Bridge left the quiet community shaken. People who once left their doors unlocked began checking locks twice at night. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them ride bicycles. The sense of safety that had defined the town fractured overnight. At the elementary school where Sarah taught, classrooms fell into silence when her death was announced. Small children did not fully understand, but they noticed her absence. Teachers gathered them for discussions, and counselors were brought in to help. In the days that followed, the hallways filled with handmade drawings and cards taped to her classroom door. Each one carried a child's attempt to honor the teacher they had lost. A vigil was held in the school gymnasium. Hundreds attended. The crowd stood with candles, heads bowed as the principal spoke of Sarah's dedication to her students. Neighbors shared memories, some recalling her steady presence during school events, others remembering how she smiled as she passed them on her evening runs. It was not dramatic displays of grief that defined the night, but the quiet unity of a community bound together by loss. At the center of it all was Margaret Hamilton. She sat quietly during the vigil, holding a single-frame photograph of her daughter. Margaret had raised Sarah alone after her husband's death years earlier. Their bond was close, and the loss cut deep. Yet even in those early days, her resolve was clear. She told reporters that she trusted investigators, but would never stop pressing for answers. Margaret began keeping a notebook, filling it with dates, details, and newspaper clippings. She made calls to detectives weekly, sometimes only to ask if there was any new development. Her persistence was not fueled by anger, but by the conviction that her daughter's case would not be forgotten. For Millbrook Township, life moved forward, but not unchanged. Streets emptied earlier in the evening. Runners avoided isolated roads, and conversations often circled back to the same question: who could have done this? The grief settled into the community, heavy but quiet. It was a silence that demanded answers, and Margaret Hamilton made it clear she would not stop searching until those answers came. The investigation into Sarah Hamilton's murder moved forward with intensity during the first year, but progress quickly met roadblocks. Each lead seemed promising at first, yet one by one they fell apart under closer scrutiny. The first major lead involved a drifter who had passed through Millbrook Township only days before Sarah's death. He was spotted sleeping in a bar not far from Copper Creek Road. Locals described him as unkempt, carrying a backpack and hitchhiking along rural highways. Detectives located him weeks later in a neighboring county and questioned him about his whereabouts on October 19th. He admitted he'd been traveling, but insisted he never saw Sarah. His clothing and belongings were tested, yet nothing matched the biological evidence collected at the crime scene. The drifter was released. Attention then shifted to a co-worker at Sarah's school. He had drawn suspicion for a vague and inconsistent alibi on the night of her murder. He claimed he had been running errands, but receipts and witness accounts placed him in different locations at conflicting times. Detectives pressed further, requesting DNA and fingerprint samples. Again, results excluded him. Without physical evidence, the shaky alibi alone could not tie him to the crime. Despite being cleared once, Tommy Rodriguez returned repeatedly to the center of suspicion. His proximity to Sarah, his nervous behavior during interviews, and the persistence of community rumors kept his name alive. Detectives brought him in for additional questioning, searching his vehicle and home for anything unusual. They found nothing that could be connected to the crime scene. DNA collected from him matched none of the samples preserved from Sarah's body. Legally, he could not be held. The limitations of forensic technology in 1999 weighed heavily on the investigation. Biological samples had been secured, but without a suspect already in the national database, there was no way to create a definitive match. Each test came back inconclusive. Each lead circled back to uncertainty. Detectives relied heavily on interviews and circumstantial evidence, but none of it built a case strong enough for charges. Rumors filled the vacuum left by the lack of answers. Some residents whispered that Sarah had been followed for weeks. Others believed her killer had been a stranger passing through town. Theories spread across coffee shops and church gatherings, but they offered little help to detectives who were drowning in speculation. Months turned to years. Reports were filed, boxes filled with transcripts and photographs, and the list of suspects grew longer rather than shorter. Each name was eventually crossed out. The frustration inside the sheriff's department grew as every promising lead collapsed. The case that had once seemed urgent began to fade from headlines. For investigators and Sarah's family, the silence was crushing. They had suspects. They had evidence. But the technology of the time left them with nothing conclusive. The trail was not cold yet, but the chill was setting in. As the first year passed without an arrest, Sarah Hamilton's murder slipped from the front pages of Michigan newspapers. By the second year, media interest had nearly vanished altogether. For detectives, the case file grew heavier, but progress stalled. Leads had been exhausted, suspects cleared, and the physical evidence collected in 1999 remained sealed in boxes, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. Inside the sheriff's department, the atmosphere around the Hamilton file shifted. Early on, Sarah's case had been the focus of long meetings, late-night calls, and strategy sessions. By the mid-2000s, it had been reduced to a routine mention in annual reviews, grouped with dozens of other open homicides across the state. Officers moved on to active cases with fresher evidence. The name Sarah Hamilton was still spoken, but with less urgency. For Margaret Hamilton, however, time did not dull the loss. Every day she carried the weight of her daughter's absence. Friends urged her to find peace, but Margaret rejected the idea that justice could be forgotten. She became the quiet but persistent force that kept the case alive. Year after year, she wrote letters to detectives, to state police, even to forensic experts she read about in magazines. She clipped articles on advances in DNA testing, underlining passages with the hope that one day those breakthroughs could be applied to her daughter's evidence. Her letters were polite, but they carried an unyielding tone. "Please do not let Sarah's file sit untouched," she wrote. She was more than a case number. Detectives responded respectfully, but often with the same explanation. Until new information surfaced or technology improved, there was little more they could do. Margaret never accepted those words as the final answer. In Millbrook Township, Sarah's absence was felt most sharply at the school where she had taught. For a time, her colleagues held vigils on the anniversary of her death, but as the years went on, attendance thinned. Younger teachers who had never known Sarah joined the staff. Students who once sat in her classroom grew up and left town. The memory of her smile, her patience, and her quiet kindness lingered only in the minds of those who had known her personally. Detectives would occasionally reopen the boxes of evidence, hoping that time or distance might spark a new perspective. They examined the fibers, the soil samples, the preserved swabs. Yet each review ended the same way. No new answers, no suspect charge. The frustration of the early investigation hardened into resignation. The case joined hundreds of other unsolved murders in Michigan, each file stacked neatly but silently in archive rooms. The silence of the passing years became its own form of tension. For the community, it was unsettling to know a killer had never been found. Parents warned their children not to jog alone, even years after Sarah's death. For Margaret, silence meant the world had grown comfortable forgetting what had happened. She refused to let that happen. She kept Sarah's photograph in her kitchen, next to the telephone. Every time she dialed a detective or mailed another letter, the photograph reminded her why she pressed forward. "I will not stop," she told friends. Sarah's voice is gone. Mine is not. By the end of the first decade, the Hamilton case existed in two very different realities. For law enforcement, it was a cold case, a file to be reopened if something new emerged. For Margaret, it remained unfinished business, an open wound that time could not close. Her persistence ensured that Sarah's name never fully disappeared into silence. But for now, silence was all the case had. 2 decades after Sarah Hamilton's murder, her case remained boxed and labeled in the archives of the Sheriff's Department. For years, detectives had opened the files only to close them again, defeated by the limits of 1999 forensic science. But in 2019, a quiet revolution in crime solving began to change everything. Across the United States, law enforcement was turning to genetic genealogy, a technique that combined traditional DNA profiling with public genealogical databases. Instead of matching a suspect directly, investigators could now search for distant relatives whose DNA had been submitted to consumer ancestry sites. From there, family trees were built, branches connected, and identities traced back to possible suspects. It was meticulous work, but it was solving cases once thought unsolvable. Detectives in Millbrook took notice. When the Michigan State Police offered to revisit old homicide files using this new method, Sarah's case was near the top of the list. The swabs and samples collected from the crime scene in 1999 were retrieved from storage. Careful hands unsealed evidence bags that had been untouched for years. Technicians prepared the degraded material with the most advanced testing methods available. Weeks later, a new DNA profile emerged, cleaner, more complete, and ready to be uploaded into a genealogical database. The profile did not point directly to a suspect, but it did not need to. Within days, partial matches began to appear. The names belonged to distant cousins and relatives who had no connection to Millbrook. Each one represented a branch of a larger family tree, a puzzle that could, with time, reveal the person responsible for Sarah's death. Investigators began the painstaking process of charting those trees. They studied census records, birth certificates, and obituaries. Generations of family connections stretched across states and counties, each link narrowing the pool of possibilities. The process was slow, but every step moved them closer. By midsummer of 2019, one name began to surface again and again as the branches converged: Kevin Fraser. He was a man with roots in the region, in his early 40s, who had lived in Millbrook at the time of Sarah's murder. His name had never appeared in the original investigation files. He was not among the early suspects or even mentioned in neighborhood interviews. But now, science was pointing directly at him. Detectives quietly pulled Fraser's background. He had worked odd jobs in construction and maintenance. His record showed no violent crimes, only minor offenses that never drew attention. But his proximity to Millbrook in 1999 and his position within the reconstructed family tree could not be ignored. Still, suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed confirmation. They began surveillance, watching Fraser's movements, waiting for the moment he would discard something that could yield DNA. Weeks passed before the opportunity arrived. One evening, Fraser left a coffee shop and tossed a used cup into a public trash bin. Detectives moved in, retrieving it as evidence. In the state crime lab, technicians compared the DNA from the cup to the profile extracted from Sarah's evidence. The results came back with chilling clarity. The match was direct. The probability of error was virtually non-existent. After 20 years of silence, Sarah Hamilton's killer had a name. For detectives who had carried the case in the back of their minds for decades, the revelation was staggering. A case that had haunted the community for years now had a suspect, not because of a confession or a new witness, but because science had finally caught up. Margaret Hamilton was notified before the news became public. The call she received in 2019 was one she had imagined for 2 decades. Detectives explained the process, the genealogy, the match. For the first time since 1999, she felt the weight of progress rather than the despair of delay. The discovery did not bring final closure, but it reignited hope. The silence of the cold case had been broken. Kevin Fraser, a man unnoticed during the original investigation, was now in the spotlight, and with him came the possibility of justice, long overdue but no less powerful. Detective Ellen Miller had built her career on methodical persistence. By 2017, she was known within the Michigan State Police as someone who would not abandon a file once it reached her desk. When she inherited the Hamilton case, it was not the first cold file she had opened, but it quickly became the one that defined her focus. The box she received was thick with documents, faded photographs, and evidence logs that told the story of a young teacher who never came home. Miller spread everything across her desk, reading every line, reviewing every report, and memorizing the sequence of events that had baffled her predecessors. It was a case that seemed to have ended before it truly began, trapped by the limits of its era. Most detectives would have archived it once again. Miller refused. She had followed developments in forensic science for years, and by the late 2010s, she understood the potential of genetic genealogy. She requested that Sarah's evidence be re-examined with the new tools now available. Her supervisors hesitated. Resources were limited, and success was uncertain. But Miller pressed forward, filing the requests, making calls to labs, and pushing the file to the front of the line. When a new DNA profile was uploaded into a genealogical database, Miller monitored every update with measured intensity. Partial matches began to appear, distant relatives whose names meant little on their own. For Miller, they were the starting points of a path she was determined to follow. Night after night, she studied family trees, tracing connections backward and forward across generations. She cross-referenced census data, scoured marriage licenses, and mapped out branches that stretched across Michigan, Ohio, and beyond. Slowly, the web of relatives began to narrow. The work was tedious, but Miller treated it as a puzzle she was born to solve. One cluster of connections led to the Fraser family. It was here that Miller's attention sharpened. Within this family tree, one individual fit the age, the timeline, and the geography of the crime: Kevin Fraser. He had lived in Ohio in later years, but had ties to Millbrook in 1999. His name had never been on the suspect list. He had no serious criminal record. He blended in, invisible to investigators who once canvassed the town. Miller began reconstructing his hidden history. She learned that Fraser worked in insurance adjusting, a career built on detail and discretion. He had married, raised children, and maintained a facade of stability. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared ordinary. But Miller saw the gaps, periods of unaccounted movement, stretches of time when he could have been in Millbrook without notice. Her fixation grew. She drove the roads around Copper Creek Bridge, retracing Sarah's final jog. She studied Fraser's family ties, confirming that the genealogical match was no coincidence. Every detail pointed to him, yet the evidence was still circumstantial, without a direct sample. Miller coordinated surveillance, waiting for the opportunity to collect discarded DNA. She was patient, knowing that one careless moment could bring confirmation. The discarded coffee cup retrieved by officers was tested, and when the results confirmed the match, Miller was the first to see the report. The name Kevin Fraser, once buried within family trees, now stood illuminated by science and persistence. Miller's obsession had not been wasted. She had taken a file frozen in time and given it new life. The case was no longer cold. It was active, and the suspect who had evaded justice for 2 decades was finally within reach. Kevin Fraser was 44 years old when detectives closed in on him. On the surface, he was the kind of man few would ever suspect. He lived in a quiet Ohio suburb, worked steadily as an insurance adjuster, and raised a family that believed in his reliability. His reputation was built on order, precision, and responsibility. He attended community events, paid his bills, and presented himself as a man without shadows. Yet beneath that image existed a truth buried for 2 decades. The DNA confirmed what no one had seen. Fraser was not the quiet family man he appeared to be. He was the unknown figure who had crossed paths with Sarah Hamilton on the night she vanished. Detectives planned the confrontation carefully. They wanted no room for denial, no chance for Fraser to escape behind excuses. He was invited to the station under the pretext of assisting with a matter connected to his family history. Calm at first, Fraser sat across the table, confident in the control he had always maintained. That control began to erode when detectives revealed the DNA match. The science left no doubt. His DNA was on evidence collected near Sarah's body. Fraser shifted in his seat, silent at first, then defensive. He asked about procedures, about possible contamination, about how old evidence could be trusted. But every word only deepened the inevitable. The match was airtight, the probability of error virtually zero. For hours he resisted, denying any connection to Sarah Hamilton. He claimed he had never met her, never jogged the trails, never even visited Copper Creek Bridge. Detectives countered each denial with the evidence, pressing him with facts he could not bend. His facade cracked slowly, layer by layer, until silence filled the room. When he finally spoke, the confession came in fragments. He said he had been in Millbrook in October 1999, visiting a friend and passing through the area. On the evening of the 19th, he drove along the rural roads near the township. He saw Sarah jogging alone. He described it as a moment of impulse, a decision made in seconds that destroyed her life and his own. Fraser admitted pulling over, approaching her under the pretense of conversation. When she resisted his advance, anger took over. He forced her from the path toward the wooded area near the bridge. The struggle was quick, brutal, and final. He left her there, walked back to his car, and drove away, convinced the night would swallow his crime. He insisted it was not planned, that he had no intention of targeting Sarah. To him, it was an opportunity, a word he repeated with chilling detachment. Detectives listened as he recounted details only the killer could know. The location of her running shoes, the position of her jacket, the injuries left by his grip. Each fact confirmed the truth that science had already revealed. Fraser's confession painted a portrait of a man who had lived 2 lives. In one, he was a dependable professional, the husband, the father who blended into every room. In the other, he carried a memory of violence, hidden so deeply that even those closest to him never suspected. He returned to his job, his family, and his community, never once drawing attention to himself. For 20 years, he succeeded in concealing what he had done. Detectives recorded every word. The confession was both a relief and a horror. It closed a gap that evidence alone could not bridge. But it also forced him to confront the randomness of Sarah's death. There had been no long-standing grudge, no carefully orchestrated plan. It was chance, a predator passing by at the wrong moment, and a young woman whose routine placed her in his path. When the interview ended, Fraser sat in silence, the weight of 2 decades pressing down on him. For years he had believed he was untouchable, that the case would remain cold forever. Now, with the walls closing in, he had no escape. The reveal of his identity sent shockwaves through Millbrook Township and beyond. Residents who had lived alongside Sarah's memory for 20 years now had a face and a name for the violence that haunted them. To them, Fraser had been invisible, a stranger who passed unnoticed, yet his act had left scars that never faded. The confession did not erase the years of uncertainty. It did not undo the grief or the silence that followed Sarah's murder, but it provided the truth her family had waited for. Margaret Hamilton, who had written letters and pleaded with investigators for 2 decades, finally heard the words she had long dreaded but also long needed. The man who killed her daughter had been found. Kevin Fraser was no longer just an ordinary insurance adjuster from Ohio. He was a man who ended Sarah Hamilton's life on a quiet autumn night in 1999, a man whose hidden truth was finally unmasked. And with that revelation, the case that once defined hopelessness shifted into the realm of justice. Kevin Fraser was taken into custody in the autumn of 2019. The man who had lived quietly as an Ohio insurance adjuster for decades was now escorted out his home in handcuffs. Neighbors watched in disbelief as squad cars lined the street. To them, Fraser had always been ordinary, polite, dependable, and unremarkable. The image shattered in a single morning. News of his arrest spread quickly across Michigan and Ohio. Headlines carried the story of the cold case solved after 20 years. For residents of Millbrook Township, the name Kevin Fraser was unfamiliar, but the revelation that he had been in their community the night Sarah Hamilton disappeared created a wave of unease. The idea that a stranger could pass through, commit violence, and then vanish into normal life lingered heavily. Fraser's family was devastated. His wife and children, blindsided by the accusations and the DNA confirmation, struggled with the double life revealed. The man they had trusted for years, the figure at their dinner table, was now exposed as a killer. Their shock mirrored the disbelief of friends and co-workers who had seen Fraser as steady and professional. For Margaret Hamilton, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. For 22 years, she had carried the weight of unanswered questions, refusing to give up even as time pressed forward. When detectives informed her of Fraser's confession, she felt relief that her daughter's case had not been forgotten. But the closure was bittersweet. The truth came with details that confirmed the brutality of Sarah's final moments. In Millbrook, schools and churches held quiet memorials, reflecting on the years of uncertainty that had shadowed the community. Teachers who once worked alongside Sarah spoke of her kindness, while townspeople remembered the fear that had spread after her disappearance. The arrest reminded them of the fragility of safety, even in small towns where trust once felt unshakable. Kevin Fraser's fall from an ordinary facade into exposed violence became a lesson in how darkness can hide in plain sight. For the Hamilton family, it meant that Sarah's story no longer ended with silence. Justice, long delayed, was finally at hand. Detective Ellen Miller stood before the cameras with measured calm. She spoke not of victory, but of persistence. The Hamilton case, she explained, was proof that time does not erase the possibility of justice. For her, it was never about chance, but about refusing to let science and determination go unused. Every file, she said, holds a voice waiting to be heard again. Margaret Hamilton chose her words carefully. For 2 decades, she had fought not for vengeance, but for truth. She spoke of Sarah's life rather than her death, reminding the community that her daughter was more than a victim. Margaret said her search had always been an act of love, an unwillingness to allow silence to define her daughter's story. The arrest brought closure, but not peace. Nothing could replace what was taken. The narration returned to the arc of the case. A crime of opportunity had left a young teacher dead and a town forever changed. For years, leads collapsed and suspicion pointed in the wrong direction. Yet science advanced, and with it, hope was restored. Genetic genealogy became the bridge between past and present, uncovering the identity of a man who believed he had hidden his crime in plain sight. The story of Sarah Hamilton became more than a local tragedy. It was a reminder that time may bury evidence, but persistence uncovers it. Communities can wait decades. Families can live in silence. Yet the truth has a way of surfacing. As the documentary closed, one line lingered in the air. Even after 22 years, the past does not sleep. It waits to be found.